All right. Hello, Dr. Collins. Thank you so much for doing this interview for me. I really think that this interview will do so much for the community of patients that I work with Crohn's and sometimes colitis, but we can get into that later on. But
Okay.
we'll just say Crohn's for the sake of this interview. I'm a practitioner working specifically with this community, really trying to spread awareness behind the things that we're going to talk about today. So if you could we could start with you just giving a little bit of an introduction of just who you are, your credentials, and what it is that you do every day.
Okay. I'm a veterinarian who trained at the University of Minnesota, got a PhD in microbiology at the University of Georgia, and I taught at Colorado State University for 8 years before moving to the University of Wisconsin in 1983. Also a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary Microbiologists, a specialty organization. I began studying MAP while I was in Colorado, and when I moved to Wisconsin, it happened to be the area of research that got attracted the most funding, and probably pretty much since I moved to Wisconsin in 1983, I've been doing research and mostly just about MAP. During my career, I've also taken advantage of the opportunity to go on sabbaticals and have spent year-long sabbaticals in Denmark, the Netherlands, Australia, and Chile,
Wow.
which has broadened my experience. And virtually all of those were also dealing with MAP in
Yeah.
different international context.
Yeah, definitely. I've got a few things I wanted to chat with you in relationship to those other countries a little later. So I'm glad you mentioned that. But so, wow, you've obviously accomplished a whole lot in your career thus far. Um, how did you find yourself interested originally? How did you initially get into the subject of this particular bacteria that you find fascinating?
Like a lot of things, it was a bit of serendipity. I had a graduate student who was actually in the military and was being funded to pursue a PhD. He was a microbiologist and interested and had skills in detection of tuberculosis bacteria. And so
Mhm.
when he came to my laboratory to work on his PhD while in Colorado, he adapted that technology called BACTEC method for detection of paratuberculosis. It was the
Mhm.
first time that technology had been used for the MAP bacteria. That
Yeah.
led me into diagnostics, and from diagnostics, I got interested in how to control the disease on farm, and I've spent a lot of time working on farms, helping dairy producers mostly control this infection, trying to apply the most cost-effective diagnostics for their situation.
Yeah. And so I know you've been, so have you specifically been researching and studying this MAP bacteria for how long would you say specifically?
Since 1980, basically.
Okay, a long time.
Yep.
So roughly maybe 30, 40 years, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yep.
Wow, that's a very long time. Can you share with us a little bit of history for those that just aren't aware, a little bit of history of the MAP bacteria, which for those of you who are new to this, MAP stands for Mycobacterium Avium Paratuberculosis, a very specific strain in the family of Mycobacterium. Um, can you tell us just a little bit of history about this bacterium, when it got recognized, how it got coined, all this stuff?
Sure. If you look at the old veterinary literature, veterinarians were seeing cows that would lose weight and get very skinny and have diarrhea for no particular reason. Most of these reports came out of the Netherlands, Denmark, and other European countries. But finally, a practitioner had a Guernsey cow in northern Germany, and he was concerned that this cow wasn't getting better, and he didn't know what the cause was. So he sent the cow to a pathology laboratory in Germany and in Dresden, and Dr. Yoni and his colleague, an American colleague, Dr. Frothingham, did a necropsy, also called autopsy for humans, to see what was the problem with this cow. And they noticed this dramatically thickened intestine. And they said it kind of looks like tuberculosis, but it seems to be somehow different. And from that day forward, we pretty much have ascribed his name to this very novel disease that he was the first one to really describe in academic journals. And so, being German, we pronounce his name the way we think it should be, which is Yoni or Yone. It's probably said differently by Germans, but Yoni's disease is what it's come to be named, and also called paratuberculosis.
Yes. Yeah. And what animals do you mostly find this MAP bacteria most common in?
It seems that this pathogen primarily likes to live in animals we call ruminants. That means they have a four-chambered stomach and they can eat grass and turn it into milk and meat protein. So ruminants include all of the cattle, bison, goats, sheep. And so those are the animals we primarily see this infection in occurring naturally.
Yeah. And goats, is it goats as well? Are goats
Yeah.
included in that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Goats and sheep.
Goats included. Yeah. Okay. And can you tell us about what, in your opinion, how does this bacteria, this infection, this Johne's disease, how does it manifest in these animals? What is the expression that takes place?
Animals become infected very early in life. They're extremely susceptible as youngsters, and they build up some degree of resistance as they become adults. So probably most all infections begin in very early in life. But then there's a long incubation period. That's the period between when the infection happens and when you see obvious signs of a disease. And those signs of disease are basically weight loss and, in some animals, diarrhea. This is all because the infection has settled down in the last part of the small intestine we call the ileum. The host animal has responded with an inflammatory response, causing the ileum to get very thickened. And in that state, it can't absorb nutrients. So what's curious about this infection is that the animals, when they have clinical Johne's disease, are showing obvious signs. They will appear to be feeling okay. Generally, they don't have a fever and they're continuing to eat well. But in spite of that, they're losing weight and dropping in milk production if they're a dairy cow. And so that's pretty much the classical manifestation of this disease.
Mm.
And in Holstein cows, this will happen on average 5 years when they're 5 years old. So that's the incubation period. They've had this infection for at least 5 years. Sometimes it waits as long as 10 years before they show clinical
Wow.
disease.
That's a really long time to stay in
Yep.
incubation, it seems. Wow. And so how do you find this bacterium so hard to control in cattle?
Um, I try to convince animal owners that it's not actually hard to control. However, it
I think
does.
with the current practices in place, why is it so hard?
Well, even with the current practices, it's not hard, but it does take a long time and it takes a significant financial investment to do it. So you can't control this infection in a month or a week, a year. For a herd owner, let's say for cattle herd owner, you're talking 5 to 8 years probably to get rid of this infection from your herd. It's a
Wow.
very long, slow process, and that part of that is because of the long incubation period.
Yeah. And what percent, that would lead me to the next, what percentage of these herds are you finding infected currently?
Well, in the United States, the USDA has done a few different surveys. The most recent one actually estimates that 90% of the US dairy herds are infected. And in most dairy producing countries, that number hovers around 50% of dairy herds. It's dairy cattle that seem to be most heavily infected, but we also find it in beef cattle herds as well. It's slightly lower infection rates.
Lower infection rates. Okay. 90%.
Yep.
Wow. That's kind of staggering,
Yeah.
especially when this is new information for someone to digest, that 90% of our of the cattle are infected, and then it takes 8 years. That's wow. And so can you touch on how resilient this pathogen is? I don't think a lot of people have a full understanding of just how hardy and resilient this very specific bacteria is.
Sure. Well, if you try to think like a bacteria, here's a bacteria that needs to leave the adult cow, let's use dairy cow for example, in the manure, get into the mouth of a baby calf to start the infection, and then the infection cycle continues. But it might not go directly into the mouth of a calf. It might hit the ground in a cow pie, out in a field, in the hot sun, or it might drop into a pond of water, and it might take a long time. It might take many months or even more than a year before the next susceptible animal ingests this bacteria to allow it to start its infection cycle again. Once it leaves the animal, it can't replicate. So it has to have a strategy for hanging out as long as it possibly can in the environment, waiting to be ingested by the next susceptible animal. And so it's developed these adaptive methods of becoming sort of like a spore, a bacterial spore that is very, very tenacious and resistant to environmental factors like heat and cold and freeze and thaw and sunlight. And it seems that in these resistant states, it's particularly resistant to heat, which is why we see that percentage of the MAP cells are even able to survive pasteurization.
Yes, yeah. And that's just a really important note to make, that this bacterium often survives pasteurization. From my understanding, it even survives chlorination. Is that true, would you say?
Yes, actually, this is not a phenomenon unique to MAP, but all mycobacteria are 300 times more resistant to chlorination, to killing by chlorine, than E. coli, which is what we primarily target our chlorination efforts at.
Right. Yeah, wow. It's hard to believe something can survive chlorine.
Yeah.
Um,
We're
yeah,
talking about the levels of chlorine that you find in your tap water.
oh, sure. Okay. If you just pour straight chlorine in it, it probably might not survive.
Right. You
But
can't kill it with.
yeah, I have read things about there being some MAP in our water supply too. Would you?
There are very few reports, but yeah, two of them, both from the EPA, have found significant numbers of MAP in tap water.
Okay. So that could be a source of
Could be a
infection
source.
potentially.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So
I might add a footnote to that. A lot of people don't know where their water comes from,
yeah.
and there's some drastic differences. And I'll just use Wisconsin as an example. Madison, where I live, all of its water is sourced from very deep wells, 300 feet or more. Whereas in Milwaukee, Lake Michigan is used as a common source of water.
Mm,
And then, of course, it goes through a treatment plant and so forth. But surface waters can be contaminated with MAP, and that can get into a domestic drinking water supply. Probably deep well water is it's not as it's not likely at all that it
yeah.
could contain MAP. So
Okay.
the likelihood it's going to be in water depends partly on the source of that water, and secondly on how many farms drain into that
Right.
surface water supply.
That makes sense. Yeah. So can you just tell us, for those that don't have a full understanding, what a zoonotic disease is specifically?
Sure. There are a certain number of infections that are primarily animal pathogens, animal infections, animal diseases, and these then can, in some instances, pass to human beings. And when the infection is capable of passing to human beings and causing disease, it's called a zoonotic infection. Originates from animals, accidentally ends up in humans, and causes disease. There's many very famous ones. Technically, COVID is a zoonotic disease. So is Lyme disease, as an example of a bacterial infection. Naturally lives in wild animal populations and actually accidentally gets into humans with the help of a tick bite.
Right. And I'm actually would love to know, because I know when MAP is transferred from an animal to a human, it has to shed its cell wall. in order to survive. Is that common in other zoonotic diseases, or?
Um, what's that's a little specific. I don't think we know exactly what MAP does when it gets into human host. A prominent theory is that it stops producing a cell wall to try to evade the human immune response. But microbes do a variety of things, and oftentimes they behave differently in the human than they do in the animal. And that, I think, that more broadly is an important consideration. Some of the diagnostics that would necessarily work on an animal don't always necessarily work on a human because the pathogen has simply changed.
Sure. Yeah. And so would you say that you find Johne's disease and it's the expression in cows very similar to that of what we call Crohn's disease in humans?
Yeah, the two diseases are so similar that the first report of what we now call Crohn's disease in 1913 by a Scottish surgeon, he just talked about it in his report. He said, gee, the intestine out of this human being looks just like the intestine I saw Dr. Johne describe in Germany. And so this theory is well over 100 years old now, that because the two diseases have similar signs, diarrhea and weight loss, and the pathology, the gross pathology, the thickened intestine, looks remarkably similar as well.
Right. Yeah, very, very similar symptoms. Was that Scottish? Was that Denzel?
Yes,
Okay.
Dalziel.
Oh, I pronounced it wrong.
Yes.
Okay, no surprise there. I was just curious because I've been, trying to read up on this lately. So, epidemiological studies are pointing to Crohn's disease in humans being associated with diet. You already touched on the percentage of what cows you find, or the number of cows that you find are infected with this pathogen. Can you elaborate on how much of our actual dairy supply and meat supply might be infected?
There are no surveys that I'm aware of that would indicate the extent to which our food supply is contaminated. There have been surveys of milk in United States, primarily from the major dairy producing states, where they did find that I think it was about 2% of retail milk samples were test positive.
Yeah.
There are no comparable surveys of meat that I'm aware of, although studies have shown that animals that are infected do result in contaminated raw meat products. But no broad-scale surveys have been done that I'm aware of. So there's studies in multiple countries, and they all in retail pasteurized, conventionally pasteurized, as we would call it, HTST pasteurized milk, and they all hover around 2% of retail samples being
okay. Yeah, that's what I thought it was 2%. That's what I had read. I've also read that they're finding it in 20% of infant formula.
Yeah, that's very controversial, and not many studies to rely on, but it appears that it has. I thought the number was closer to 10%, but that it has been cultured live from retail infant formula.
Yeah. Okay. I somehow found 20%, but regardless, whether it's 10 or 20%, it's rather disheartening, especially exposing the young to it when you're finding that the cows are most susceptible at a young age, and perhaps that is with humans too, that it stays in incubation period for such a long time.
Right.
So yeah, it makes me sad when I read that our infant formula can be infected. Let's talk about diagnostic procedures. I mean, I know about how to help a person get diagnosed with the MAP bacterium. We can talk a little bit about that, but from your standpoint, from a veterinary standpoint, how are we to diagnose these cows? Fine.
We have a lot of technology available to diagnose the infection in animals. We can do a blood test for antibodies, which is a rapid, low-cost screening test. We can culture the microbe from fecal samples, manure samples. We can also use PCR technology looking for the genes of this bacteria. And we can do that on manure samples or tissue samples. And so, yeah, we have pretty robust diagnostic tools. Everybody would like them to be better, and everybody's struggling to improve them. But in my opinion, they're adequate to the job of trying to control Johne's disease in animals.
Yeah. So there are ways.
There are ways.
Yeah.
To clarify, the IS-900 is a gene that's unique to MAP bacteria, and it's a very popular target when we're looking for MAP bacteria in manure or tissue samples. But the genetic link for Crohn's disease, there are specific genes. One is labeled NOD2, and it is shown to be, mutations are shown to be more common in people that develop Crohn's disease than in healthy control subjects.
Yeah.
Interestingly, that same gene has also been shown directly related to susceptibility to mycobacteria. And so the conventional school of thought is that people have an autoimmune disease from this genetic defect, when in fact, if we look at this a different way, they might be, this gene might confer susceptibility to mycobacteria, which leads to an infection, and Crohn's disease may be an infectious disease.
So the IS-900 is specifically tied to the Mycobacterium.
Right, and there's about 15 copies per MAP cell, and that makes it a very friendly target in terms of trying to find the few MAP bacteria that might be in a sample. But IS-900 is unique to MAP bacteria.
Gotcha. Okay. And so why do you think, in your opinion, why haven't vets or FDA officials taken any real responsibility for this threatening bacteria that's finding its way, clearly finding its way into our food supply? And, you know, considering, you know, at this point, it's not even thousands, it's millions of people that are getting diagnosed globally with, you know, things like Crohn's disease.
Well, that's a great question. I wish I had a concrete answer.
Yeah, it is the question, right? So.
In the United States, some of these regulatory oversight is in different agencies. So the FDA will actually govern milk and milk hygiene and milk safety standards. And the US Department of Agriculture will govern meat and meat standards and meat inspection and so forth. But it's the Centers for Disease Control that basically decides how to label these pathogens as zoonotic or not. And then if that determination is made that it's zoonotic, then you have downstream regulatory officials like FDA and USDA deciding, okay, what do we have to do about this? So broadly, the medical community at large has discounted MAP as being important in Crohn's disease or IBD or colitis. And so they've not labeled it a zoonotic pathogen. If you don't have that label, then everybody else's hands are kind of tied to do much of anything. Veterinarians may feel strongly that this is a human pathogen, and yet every day dairy cows produce milk, infected dairy cows produce milk that goes into the food chain. Cattle that are showing clinical symptoms are sent to the slaughterhouse, and it's allowed to go in the food chain. And so sadly, there's no legal requirement because it's not labeled as zoonosis.
Wow. That makes me want to skip ahead to some further questions about what some other countries are doing, but we'll come back to that, because I want to just kind of go back to an organization that you did touch on just a moment ago, and that was the Center for Emerging Zoonotic Infectious Disease. And this center is the center that really should be the one that's acknowledging and that this is a thing, correct? This is, a lot of people have never heard of that center, don't know what that center is or does, don't even know that there is such an organization that exists, you know, to stand up for, you know, issues such as this. And I just want that to be known, that there is a specific organization that should be, in our humble opinion, in my humble opinion, taking more responsibility and recognizing this infection, and they're not. And so do you have any, you know, opinion as to why specifically this organization is failing to do that?
You're talking about a section within the Centers for Disease Control, and you're right, it's their responsibility to deal with emerging and zoonotic infections. And I'm disheartened by the fact that they don't discuss paratuberculosis at all, at least to even discuss the pros and the cons about whether it is a zoonosis.
Yeah.
It would be helpful to have more leadership there to get this scientific dilemma out in a public forum to talk about.
For them to just even, you know, have an intelligent dialogue, you know, about it, I think would be just huge. But it doesn't even seem like that's going to be the case anytime soon, or maybe it will be down the road. I don't know. I guess we'll remain hopeful.
I hope so.
Yeah. Are there things that you do that to try to, you know, propel that trajectory of that happening, or are your hands kind of tied in that?
Well, I retired at the end of 2019, and
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah,
Okay.
my professional work is now largely restricted to sustaining the yonis.org website as a means of distributing the most accurate, high quality, and current scientific information possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to try to be a resource. As a consequence of that website, I talk to animal owners on a daily basis, or by email or by phone. And this site is largely directed at the general public, and more specifically, animal owners and veterinarians. I'm not trying to have a high-level scientific dialogue with my colleagues. That's done in other forums, but this is generally to provide everybody the most accurate information possible. And I deal with why MAP is so resistant, how it is, when it is found in food, all of the literature supporting the fact that this might be a zoonotic infection, as well as other typical stuff that animal owners are interested in, and how to diagnose and control the infection. So that's my professional activity, is largely hovers around yonis.org and fielding questions from people just like you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a lot. That's not just a little bit of a contribution. So we certainly appreciate it. I'm glad you mentioned that website, because I was going to ask you about that, to tell our readers about your site, and I'll certainly link that in the description below when this is launched on YouTube. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so that's an unfortunate reality that we can't get this organization to speak or recognize what's going on. Can you tell us what exactly, from a scientific standpoint, the precautionary principle is, so that my audience has an understanding of what that is?
Regulatory organizations need a framework as to how to go about making decisions on things that affect public health in general, let's say. And in that principle, you look at how serious a problem is this. Let's take Crohn's disease. It's not an insignificant problem, and it's a lifelong problem. And how certain are you that this particular risk factor, in this case, we're thinking of MAP, how certain is scientific literature that this is related to that disease? And you look at those two parameters, and there's always going to be uncertainty. But if the disease is serious and the uncertainty is high that this is the cause, then you simply ban that substance, that microbe, that chemical to the best of your ability. And so it's hard to put MAP and Crohn's disease on that graphic, you might say, about the precautionary principle, but the Europeans have done it, and the Europeans are the ones that use the precautionary principle to guide their formulation of public health policy. And many have exercised in the EU have thought, well, based on the precautionary principle, there's enough concern about MAP as a cause of Crohn's disease that we should do something about it.
Yeah.
The United States doesn't generally use the precautionary principle. They use what we call cost-benefit analysis to try to make public health policy decisions. So, yeah, Wikipedia does a great job describing the precautionary principle and the history of it. I'm not an expert in that, but I think it's a very pertinent principle to apply. But we have to understand that that's used more often in the EU than it is in the United States.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for differentiating that. That brings me to my next question is, it's my understanding that there are a few other countries that are taking more responsibility and being more activist with this, this bacteria and everything that it's causing. Do you know a little bit about what some of these, maybe Australia, the UK, what these countries are doing with their cattle that the US might not be doing?
Actually, many countries, and to be fair, the United States too. The United States had a line item investment of over $160 million in the early 2000s to control Johne's disease, and they built a fantastic infrastructure with laboratory certification programs, veterinary certification programs, discounted diagnostic tests, expansion of diagnostic services across the United States, and a lot of farmer education. And so the United States has a pretty strong infrastructure as a consequence of that investment, but now it depends on animal agriculture to step up and use that infrastructure. The Australians did the same thing. In fact, they did it for multiple species of animals, including cattle, sheep, goats, and llamas. The Netherlands was one of the pioneers in programs for paratuberculosis, and now tests all of their dairy herds, I think annually, for this disease. The latest comers to the international table are the UK, which has a strong program, and most recently Ireland, which also has a strong program. And in those countries, it's the industry itself that's making the investment, more so to some extent the taxpayer as well, but in partnership with the stakeholders in the processing sector as well as the producer sector to try to make more robust paratuberculosis control programs. So there's been quite a bit of international effort, and the US was one of those countries. Our program has kind of lapsed and is not very active right now, but we clearly made a large investment to do that. So again, I go back to the zoonosis question. The infrastructure is largely there, but the regulatory impetus will be much stronger if this was agreed on as a zoonotic infectious agent.
Okay, it's interesting that they would put the infrastructure in place, but then not really follow through. Like what's where's the disconnect there?
The disconnect is that this disease, although it makes cows sick and it makes cows produce less milk, in the greater scheme of things, for a dairy producer, for example, it's not that costly. And a dairy producer is always asking his or herself, how much money do I invest and how much money am I going to get back out of this? And Johne's control programs are very long-term and rather expensive. And so a lot of producers said, if somebody else isn't helping me out here, I can't shoulder all the investment to control this disease because I'm getting no return on my investment. The commercial milk sector is not paying more for my milk because my herd is free of Johne's disease. So how am I going to get a payback? And so I think we need, ideally, we would need more market-driven systems where, in fact, the people who buy the milk from the farmer paid more for milk from test negative herds. And those charges would likely be passed on to consumers who would agree to pay more for milk from test negative herds and test negative processors. So there's no economic driver. There's no economic driver. And without this being labeled as zoonosis, there's no regulatory driver. So we're asking farmers to shoulder all of the cost of doing this
Yeah.
with no return on the investment.
So it's largely comes down to dollars often with
Yep.
why this isn't being hit head on by a lot of farmers, because it can be damaging financially to their operation.
It can be, but we've all learned a lot about this disease, and I would say farmers today are pretty savvy about. They know that they need to do some efforts to control the infection, and they know exactly what those things are, and they do the least cost approach to control the infection at a low level, so it's not hurting them economically. But to eradicate the infection would be a huge financial cost, and so they're not investing to eradicate it. It's just keeping it at a low, sort of smoldering level where it's not costing them too much money.
And how exactly would they completely eradicate it? Like what does that look like?
That looks like testing all your animals, all your adult animals, once every year, slaughtering all of the positives,
Not selling
and
them off to be used for meat.
ideally, well, unless regulatory things change, they are going to go into the food chain. But thinking again of the animal owner, they're just going to slaughter those animals. And on the animal husbandry side, they need to do things in the way they raise baby calves to limit their exposure to the manure from adult cows.
Yeah.
So very clean maternity pens, very clean colostrum, very clean milk fed to the calves, um, clean feeded water, to try to get them through that susceptible period. So it's a combination of improved animal husbandry, annual diagnostic testing, and a program that involves pretty much slaughtering all of the animals that are designated as infected, and being ready to do that for 5 to 10 years.
Right. A huge commitment, a huge undertaking that's
Yes, it is.
just not often realistic for these people, I would assume.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's very unfortunate, but that's the reality at this point. Um, you touched on you mentioned ulcerative colitis in something that you said a few moments ago, and I was just wondering if you had it. The whole reason I got into this work is that's actually my diagnosis is ulcerative colitis, and has been my diagnosis for 20 something years. And I tested positive for the MAP bacteria through Okatera pathways through John Atkin. And when it started to get treated like an infection, I started to really improve. So I clearly have a MAP infection. That is my opinion. And I have, my diagnosis is not Crohn's disease, it's ulcerative colitis. In your experience, have you, I know you're not a doctor, but have you witnessed that in your career, that this infection, this zoonotic disease, is not limited to Crohn's disease, but perhaps ulcerative colitis and IBD, patients and other things that, humanpara.org is actually recognizing as well. But do you have any insight to share in that regard, that it's not necessarily limited to Crohn's disease?
Sure. Well, I'll repeat your disclaimer. I'm not an MD, and so I just read the literature peripherally. But MAP has been found in people with ulcerative colitis and IBS, as well as Crohn's disease. It seems that we find it more often in Crohn's, but it's not just restricted to Crohn's. And I know personally of patients who've lived with a diagnosis ulcerative colitis only to have surgery, and then they change the diagnosis to Crohn's and vice versa. So the diagnostics in terms of classifying people in terms of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis is not perfect. In fact, they have a category for the in-between. They call it indeterminate, so they're not really sure which it is.
That was my
So,
initial diagnosis. So,
yeah. So I think there's a spectrum of inflammatory bowel diseases, and they probably overlap in many regards, and we don't have a particularly perfect way of classifying them. And MAP has been associated with all in varying levels depending on the study.
yes. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted that to be reiterated to my audience because we are in this conversation mostly talking about, MAP in relationship to Crohn's, but it's just important to note that it doesn't necessarily stop there. It's definitely has shown some correlation with IBD in general, sometimes IBS, and now organizations like humanparent.org are showing some associations between MAP and things like MS and leprosy and diabetes. So that's a conversation that goes beyond this interview, but it's just something that I wanted to touch on, that it's not just limited to Crohn's.
Exactly.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we can do, just the layperson or even myself, to help advocate, to help spread awareness, to become an activist for for fighting this cause? I mean, it sometimes, from my experience, I was very, very sick for so many years, and I am so passionate at this moment in my career about helping spread awareness. But I still feel so small, and it still feels like I can do very little. And I'm just wondering, you've obviously made huge contributions, and there'll be, ripples effect, a rippling effect of your work, for years to come, and so, we're just so grateful for people, such as yourself and John Atkin, who have spent basically your entire careers devoted to a really important cause. And I think it's probably right around the corner that it's a pivotal time in medicine, with a lot of these conditions, autoimmune conditions specifically. And so I guess just, is there anything that you think that an average Joe can do?
Well, I think it's like the old phrase: think globally, act locally.
Mm,
Each of the people with GI issues has a gastroenterologist or a general practitioner at least, who needs to be better informed.
yes.
It doesn't have to be a heated argument. Hopefully you have a physician who's open-minded enough to look at literature that maybe they hadn't seen before. These are people who run very busy practices and they can't stay on top of everything. They're lucky if they get to go to one national meeting a year. And so arming yourself with facts, with the best published literature possible, and going into the office and saying, can we have a conversation about this? I also think that at some point, when you meet very obstinate physicians who've made up their mind and don't want to have these conversations, perhaps it's time to find a different physician. And so I think it serves the patient's own interests, as well as serving the broader interests of educating the medical community about this, what they might view as just a veterinary problem. And I would just do it one-on-one. And I think that's probably, over the long haul, going to have the biggest effect.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's unfortunate that I have now had I think three gastroenterologists who just including my most recent one, who just completely shut me down. I wrote an ebook on this very subject matter, that's on my website. That's, you know, $10. It's like 60 pages. It goes into the history and just has all the resources. And I even recently tried to get my my new gastroenterologist to I brought him a copy of it, and he refused to read it. So, you know, I clearly didn't stay with him. But, and I'm not saying this to be negative. I'm just saying that there's still a very, it's unfortunate that there's still a population of professionals in the medical community that still aren't willing to look at anything beyond, you know, what they learned. But, you know, I have had experiences with medical professionals that are open.
Sure.
So those exist. And, you know, we need to find those people and find an in and spread awareness as much as possible.
Yep.
And that is the way. So I love what you had to say about that. I guess I was just wondering if there was anything else that we could do, you know, petitions or calls or this or that, but my guess is probably not at this point. It is kind of almost word of mouth, essentially.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, is there any, you know, I guess in conclusion, you've shared so much and so appreciate your time, you know, with answering these questions. Is there any message just from, you know, kind of a human standpoint that you'd like to share with those that are just, you know, there's people right now that are, you know, living with a bag or threatening to get their colon removed, or they're just very, very sick. What is there a message from your experience? I'm sure you've witnessed quite a lot over the years with these conditions and seen, you know, patients. Is there anything that you would just like to say to this community?
Well, you know, from my contact with a number of people affected by IBD, I would say that the idea that MAP might be an underlying problem can give some hope, because many of these people have failed every other therapy. And as in your case, I know personally people who have not only felt better, but are basically cured. I posted the story of a veterinarian, a German veterinarian, on my website, who, after discovering the diagnosis, met with John Herman Taylor, a prominent MAP believer in the UK, was treated and has been totally Crohn's free without any treatments for 15 years. And so there is hope out there. And with the existing therapies, all the medical profession can provide is a hope and a prayer to minimize the symptoms.
Mm.
They have no hope for a cure because they don't know the cause.
Mm.
I'm not saying MAP causes all of this disease, and you have to understand that so every patient is individual, but MAP therapy has helped a significant number of people recover and in fact live free of this disease, which is sort of unheard of. And how any physician could ignore that possibility is just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
The other thing I think from the causal perspective, and here I'm speaking as a veterinarian and an advocate for the agriculture community, they don't want to be, they're not trying to infect people. They're not trying to spread disease, but this can be a economic burden to animal agriculture, and they need some help. And so in the economic model I described, I think if this was labeled as zoonosis, public health authorities would get more taxpayer dollars, which would flow downstream to the animal producers to control this infection, ultimately ending up in a healthier and safer food supply.
Yeah.
But it takes financing, and you just can't ask farmers to do it all. So whether it's by sort of capitalistic methods with a tax on milk, or whether it's done more broadly as a public health measure, animal agriculture and veterinary medicine has all the knowledge and all the tools necessary to provide raw milk free of MAP and raw meat that is free of MAP to lead to a healthier human population.
Mm.
But
Mm.
as you said, it takes money, and it's just not
Yeah.
a trivial amount of money, and it takes a coordinated effort at a national level, in my estimation,
Yeah.
to do this. So you have to develop the will. So nobody wants this to be in the food supply, but there's no overriding drivers to get it
Right.
out of the food
Yeah.
supply
These
yet.
people are, they're not intentionally devastating, our health and our reality. This is just, it's just a problem, and it's an epidemic now. And, to my understanding, there's a country or several countries where you can, just like in the US, when you go to the grocery store and you pay a little more money to get certified organic food, that in certain countries you can even pay a little bit more money to get certified MAP-free food. I want to say the Netherlands. I was just talking to John about this a couple weeks ago. I'm blanking on which country it is, but I want to say the Netherlands or Japan, one of those. There's certain areas where you can even go to the grocery store and buy certified MAP-free food. And I just think that that's amazing. And gosh, wouldn't that be helpful if it were that simple and we knew that we weren't at risk of being exposed by purchasing certain items at the grocery store?
Yeah, I think that might be an interesting interim approach, but broadly, it doesn't protect the larger public.
Sure.
On that same note, I should mention that people like the organic label, and it gives them some confidence about chemicals exposures, but it says nothing about MAP. This infection can be on dairy herds of 5,000 cows and dairy herds of 50 cows. It can be in conventional dairy farms or beef farms. It can be in organic dairy or beef
Yes.
farms.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're making that point. That's really important to know.
Yeah,
But yeah, buying organic dairy or organic red meat does not mean that there's that there's not MAP exposure.
correct.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Collins. I honestly I had no idea that you were retired. So you're clearly still at it, which we appreciate. Do you ever end up, or I guess did you, since you're retired, end up at the MAP conference that takes place in Berkeley?
I skipped I was at the one before that was in Temple University in Pennsylvania. I skipped the one in Berkeley, and instead I did a promotional video for that, talking about many of the same things we did here.
Oh,
My favorite annual meeting is the International Colloquium on Paratuberculosis, which is largely veterinarians and animal producers and regulatory agencies. It was supposed to take place in Dublin in 2020, but it's been rescheduled twice. Now, hopefully it'll happen in June of 2022. And at that meeting, we cover a lot of animal health issues, but we also touch on the public health and safety issues as well.
oh, wow.
Um,
Okay.
so that's a great source of the most current information.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I was going to say, I'm planning on trying to make it to the next. There is an annual conference every year where professionals meet to talk about MAP in Berkeley. And I was going to say, maybe someday I'd get to meet you if you should decide to attend there.
Maybe I'll be there, maybe.
But you're retired. You're clearly still at it in many ways. And thank you for all the work that you've done and continue to do. I know it makes such a difference.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you so much for your time. And, maybe down the road, if anything monumental comes to be and there's shifts in this arena or that arena when it comes to MAP, perhaps we could have another discussion, just so we can stay, in touch and connected, so that if there is movement, that we can stay updated and people are aware.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. I think both of us are trying to do the same thing, and that is provide accurate quality information so more people understand this problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Collins.
Okay. Take care. Have a good day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.